how many choices you make in a typical day? Do you know how many choices you make in a typical week? I recently did a survey with over 2,000 Americans, and the average number of choices that the typical American reports making is about 70 in a typical day. There was also recently a study done with CEOs in which they followed CEOs around for a whole week. And these scientists simply documented all the various tasks that these CEOs engaged in and how much time they spent engaging in making decisions related to these tasks. And they found that the average CEO engaged in about 139 tasks in a week. Each task was made up of many, 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 many sub-choices, of course. 50% of their decisions were made in 9 minutes or less. Only about 12% of the decisions did they make in an hour or more of their time. Think about your own choices. Do you know how many choices make it into your 9-minute category versus your 1-hour category? How well do you think you're doing at managing those choices? Today I want to talk about one of the biggest modern-day choosing problems that we have, which is the choice overload problem. I want to talk about the problem and some potential solutions. Now, as I talk about this problem, I'm going to have some questions for you, and I'm going to want to know your answers. So when I ask you a question, since I'm blind, only raise your hands if you want to burn off some calories. Otherwise, when I ask you a question, and if your answer is yes, I'd like you to clap your hands. So for my first question for you today, are you guys ready to hear about the choice overload problem? Thank you. So when I was a graduate student at Stanford University, I used to go to this very, very upscale grocery store. At least at that time, it was truly upscale. It was a store called Draeger's. Now this store, it was almost like going to an amusement park. They had 250 different kinds of mustards and vinegars and over 500 different kinds of fruits and vegetables and more than 24 different kinds of bottled water. And this is during a time when we actually used to drink tap water. I used to love going to this store, but on one occasion, I asked myself, well, how come you never buy anything? Oh, here's their olive oil aisle. They had over 75 different kinds of olive oils, including those that were in a locked case that came from 1,000-year-old olive trees. So I one day decided to pay a visit to the manager, and I asked the manager, you know, is this model of offering people all this choice really working? And he pointed to the busloads of tourists that would show up every day, with cameras ready usually. We decided to do a little experiment. And we picked jam for our experiment. Here's their jam aisle. They had 348 different kinds of jam. We set up a little tasting booth right near the entrance of the store. We either put out 6 different flavors of jam or 24 different flavors of jam. And we looked at 2 things. First, in which case were people more likely to, stop, sample some jam? More people stopped when there were 24, about 60%, than when there were 6, about 40%. The next thing we looked at is in which case were people more likely to buy a jar of jam. And now we see the opposite effect. Of the people who stopped when there were 24, only 3% of them actually bought a jar of jam. Of the people who stopped when there were 6, well, now we saw that 30% of them actually bought a jar of jam. Now, if you do the math, people were at least 6 times more likely to buy a jar of jam if they encountered 6 than if they encountered 24. Now, choosing not to buy a jar of jam is actually probably good for us, at least it's good for our waistlines. But it turns out that this choice overload problem affects us even in very consequential decisions. We choose not to choose even when it goes against our best self-interests. So now for the topic of today, financial savings. This is a study that I did with now I'm going to describe to you a study I did with Gur Huberman, Amir Kaminica, Wei Zhang, where we looked at the retirement savings decisions of nearly 1 million Americans from about 650 plans, all in the US. And what we looked at was whether the number of fund offerings available in a retirement savings plan, the 401k plan, does that affect people's likelihood to save more for tomorrow? And what we found was that indeed there was a correlation. So in these plans, we had about 657 plans that ranged from offering people anywhere from 2 to 59 different fund offerings. And what we found was that the more funds offered, indeed, there was less participation rates. So if you look at the extremes, those plans that offered you 2 funds, participation rates were around in the mid-70s, still not as high as we want it to be. In those plans that offered nearly 60 funds, participation rates have now dropped to about 60 percentile. Now, it turns out that even if you do choose to participate when there are more choices present, even then, it has negative consequences. So for those people who did choose to participate, the more choices available, the more likely people were to completely avoid stocks or equity funds. The more choices available, the more likely they were to put all their money in pure money market accounts. Now, neither of these extreme decisions are the kinds of decisions that any of us would recommend for people when you're considering their future financial well-being. Well, over the past decade, we have observed 3 main negative consequences to offering people more and more choices. They're more likely to delay choosing, procrastinate, even when it goes against their best self-interest. They're more likely to make worse choices, worse financial choices, medical choices. They're more likely to choose things that make them less satisfied, even when they do objectively better. The main reason for this is because, well, we might enjoy gazing at those giant walls of mayonnaises, mustards, vinegars, jams, but we can't actually do the math of comparing and contrasting and actually picking from that stunning display. So what I want to propose to you today are 4 simple techniques that we have tested in one way or another in different research venues that you can easily apply in your business